train station with Father Jim Pfeiffer. He'll be looking for you there. And next week, we have the Reverend Dr. Julie Faith Parker with us as our preacher of the week, a fellow classmate of Dr. Simpson's at Union Theological Seminary, and she'll be talking specifically about her new book, Eve Isn't Evil, about women in the Bible. And we will, in addition to the regular Faith for Living on Tuesday, we'll be having lunch with Julie Faith Parker at Hotel Lakeside, and so you can plan on that for next week as well. And then our seminar next week is with Dave Blank, and Dave is here with us this morning. Dave, you want to put up your hand? If you don't know Dave, you need to know Dave because he's a great guy. Anyway, he'll be our seminar leader. What's that? I pay you a lot. Yeah, the check's in the mail, right? Dave Blank will be doing our seminar next week on Monday afternoon at the train station from 3 to 4:30, and his topic is Lincoln's Pastors. And as you know, Abraham Lincoln was not a church member, but he was influenced by several pastors and influenced them as well, and a great figure. Some think, of course, the most significant president we've ever had in this country. So Dave will be talking to us about Lincoln and his religious life next Monday, and you don't want to miss that. So here is Dr. Gary Simpson. Please give him Lakeside welcome.
I am tremendously blessed to have spent this time with you, and I am grateful and changed by the conversations that we have had together. And I thank you again, Charlie and Barb, for your hospitality and kindness and hosting, and to Dale and Tina Noble, and to so many of you that I have met, those of you who came over to Ooh La La, and we just, as the young people say, chopped it up a bit and talked about things. I appreciate what this space does for me. Last evening, I had the opportunity to watch the sun set over Lake Erie. It was absolutely stunning, and I was glad to do that. I didn't have to look around buildings or anything like in New York. They say something is happening in the sky, you've got to get yourself to a place where there's not an obstruction. But in this instance, I've been grateful. Thank you for your hospitality and your kindness, and most importantly, for your conversations. And so today, I want to wrap up this, or open up, as it were, this ending of this text. And remember that everything that happens in this 4th chapter of John happens because of what seemed at first to be a very strange and yet arbitrary meeting in the middle of the day between a woman who was unnamed in the story and someone we had been following for 3 chapters at least in John's gospel. We had no idea how it would turn out, but I want to talk now about legacy. And so often in our world, we are caught between 2 things. One is the terror of the right now. We are stuck in this particular moment, time, space, responding to things as people in this time and space would respond, perhaps differently from the people who would have responded 100 or 1,000 years ago, and absolutely different from those who are coming behind us. So when I was in Columbus, as a child, every once in a while on a Friday night, we'd get the treat. My dad would say to us, "Let's go to dinner." And we'd pile in the car, and this was the time of the drive-in dinners. Person would come out, take your order, you'd talk on what seems now to be a very primitive radio, make your order, and they come through. And or we'd go to one of the local steakhouses and eat. And when we did that on Friday, we always knew when he said, let's go to eat, we're going to go to the steakhouse or possibly to that space. Then I had my own children. And I wanted to, and we would always sit in the same seat. We would park in the same space if we could, and we would frown at the people who might be sitting in the place that was our space there. We always ordered the same thing. There was no deviation from what we ordered. I always got a cheeseburger with no pickles. Always the same thing. We did not have a choice, it appeared, to do anything else. Well, I have 3 children. One's a millennial. One is Gen Z. The other is 2 millennials and a Gen Z. Well, so I decided it was time when the 2 that were old enough to go out. We're going out to dinner on Friday. I had picked out the restaurant and everything, just like my dad did. And I remembered that. But they grew up in a world very differently from me. And when I say, let's go out to dinner, my son would say, what are our options? Now, it's not the place I want to go anymore. I am subject to the things that they want to describe. And now, because sibling rivalry is real, when he says he wants a hamburger, his sister says, no, because she's the oldest, and she liked to kind of bully him at that point. He's now 6'11". I told her it was going to change. One of these days, he's going to grow past you, and you're going to regret everything you've ever done to him. So if he said he wanted a cheeseburger, she would say, I want pizza, just to smite him, right? And there we were, negotiating space. So I had to find a restaurant that had what I may have wanted in the beginning and what my son and my daughter wanted. And then the baby comes later. So let's go out to dinner on Friday. The first 2 get started in their rivalry. What are our options? I want something differently. The baby says, I don't want to go. From me living in a world of such certainty and predictability to the world of options, that it could be that we were going to a restaurant, not A, B, or C restaurant, to a restaurant. My children, the older 2 come in, and now they suggest it is not just A, Dad, it is also B and C. And then the baby comes up, and she blows everything up by saying D, none of the above. And we are always negotiating that space with our senses of certainty and preference and desire and hope and preconceived notions and all of that, but not just with our children, but with the children of others, and not just with children, but with each other. When we have a conversation, we learn that life is not just A. It could be A or B and C, or it could be A, B, and C, or it could be none of the above. And that is the predicament in which we live on a daily basis. I want to talk about legacy, because those are very much my children. No doubt about it, every one of them. Emma says that each one of the children has an exaggerated part of my personality. So I have the one who is the thought leader. That's my oldest. I have another one who would never, ever be interested in pastoral life in the church, but he is very much a pastoral presence to the people in his circle, and he does things to serve people. I told you he was 6'11", when he was in the 9th grade, he went out for the basketball team at his high school, and the coach kept him on. He made the high school team, and then a couple of days later, he came home. I said, "How was basketball practice?" He said, "I quit." I said, "David, why did you quit?" He said, "Because I knew that there were some guys who were better than me who got cut from the team, and that was not fair." That's what he said. He wasn't really coordinated, but he was 6'10", and they could work with him, you know. And here I'm thinking, boy, there goes my season seats at Madison Square Garden, you know. And this presumption that because he is tall, and let me add to this the unsaid thing that he is black, that all he will do is play basketball. He never played basketball after that, except on pickup games, because he didn't want people to put him in the box of a stereotype. The baby is, as I said, 6, 7 years younger than the others, and she's a firebrand. There's just no way to describe that. She's a librarian. I'm afraid she's read every book in the library where she works. She always comes up with this curiosity about the world. They are all something like me, but they are not me. And that differentiation is important. The legacy of our commitment as a family to always think about the people who have been left out, commitments to justice, to be compassionate with strangers. Those are the legacies that we leave, not that I am the senior pastor of the Concord Baptist Church of Christ. But thanks be to God, despite all the things that they could have done, that they, at this point, have a commitment to being good people in the world. And that's the best legacy of all. Well, Miriam, as we said earlier, we're not sure whether or not she has children. We know that she doesn't have sons. If she did have sons, they were knuckleheads because they weren't taking care of her. And she found herself going back and again into making relationships. So we now come to the end of this, and I want to read this passage for you. I did remember to pull my excavating glasses out. And so here is the way this passage ends in verse 39. After the discussion Jesus had with them about reaping and sowing, we get these words. Many Samaritans from that city believed in him, meaning Jesus, because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I have ever done. So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. And many more believed because of his word. They said to the woman, "It is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard it for ourselves, and we know that this is truly the Savior of the world." So we started out on Sunday with a well that was very deep, too deep even for what Miriam thought. She drops her jar and goes forward to declaring to everyone, "Come and see a man." We're really happy because we see that she is rejoicing. We are inspired by her joy. Have you ever noticed that we have not spent any more time talking about her social circumstances and the things she's done, the men in her life, the circumstances of her situation? We have become affixed to the transforming power of this conversation with Jesus. Our forebearers who used to sing a song that we would sing, some of you may know it, "Just a little talk with Jesus makes it right." Just a simple conversation bursts not all of these things only in her, but in the people around them. So much so that as she went around telling people what was happening or what had happened or what Jesus had said, our text begins that many Samaritans from that city believed in him because of her testimony. Yes, she becomes the city's evangelist. She is the proclaimer of the power of Jesus. Notice that she has not gone to any school or seminary. She is not considered at this point a disciple in the same way of those 12 that has followed her. She is a woman in the middle of a culture and that thinks that women should be quiet and silent, but she could not contain what was going on in her, and she only made influence by telling her simple story. Another song from my tradition: you don't know like I know what God's done for me. But if you take a little time with me, I'll be glad to tell you. This text is very clear that she was very convincing, because it says many believed because of her story. She didn't get into an argument about a whole lot of things like how many angels fit on the head of a pin, or what does it really mean for a rich person to on a camel to get through the eye of a needle. It was not that. It was just simply a rehearsal of her encounter with Jesus, and that was enough not only to pique the curiosity, but to make them start to believe. We were talking about this a little bit the other day. As a preacher, I do not preach points. I am not trying to make a point. My predecessor was asked that once. Well, how many points should a sermon have? He said, well, at least one, he would say. But I'm more of a storyteller. You've met a lot about me in this place. I've told you things about myself and my family and all of its idiosyncrasies. You even know my nickname, Pee-wee. And nobody has called me that this week. I'm surprised. I don't hate the name. It actually keeps me ever reminded that no matter how big I think I am, to be honest, I was always the runt. Mischievous, as I told you. Getting into trouble with church people all the time. And yet, when I think about all of the opportunities that have, not because of me, but because the God who has pulled me into this work has given me opportunity to do things I never would have dreamed of. And so whenever I go, I tell my story. It's one thing for you to come hear somebody who's a talking head and all you get are their ideas. What I'm really trying to do is to say to us in these conversations that every one of us has a story and it is valued, and we should see each other. We should never walk around because we are an image-based culture. We are visually based. Jacques Ellul, the French philosopher, wrote a book in the mid-'80s called The Humiliation of the Word, where he was kind of recognizing that we were getting more caught up in images than we were in listening to each other and thinking about the Word. Well, I want to tell this story from her because the story isn't over when people stop talking about us in the moment, in the right now. There are some things about us that people who are yet unborn, all the things we think are important to us, that people who are yet unborn, when they go back, they're going to look at this period and make some generalizations about us. God forbid. And that's why we have to tell our story. So here it is. Our friend Jim was right. I've been calling her Miriam because that was the only access I had to her from my experience. I told you about Myrtle Brathwaite, the social worker at Concord. Her son is a member of the church now, and he's one of those members. There's always one or two people in church who will Google everything you say to make sure you're talking right. So, Bruce came to me. I love that. I really do. He said, Rev, I've been reading about this woman at the well, the Samaritan, and you know she was venerated, and she was made a saint. And, we've been calling her Miriam, but her name is Fotini. I said, whoa, Bruce. Bruce is not a New Testament scholar. He's just a person with a curious mind and access to data. And he pulled up the things on her, and I looked them up. And the next week, I said, as we finish this, I need to say that some scholars and some traditions, and Bruce Brathwaite, let us know that she was not as unknown as it appeared in the writing of John. That in fact, that as we've heard this week, that the Eastern Orthodox Church has a time that is given to her. I want to make sure I tell that right because I know Jim is here. She was, in fact, in Eastern Orthodox Church, her feast, they have a feast for her every fourth Sunday after Easter began. That's what the Eastern Orthodox do. In Mexico, the fourth Friday of Lent is held in her honor. I don't want you to miss this thing, and I want you to understand how it breaks all of the barriers and the chains of misogyny and patriarchy that are so alive, almost instinctual in first century Palestine. The church later not only makes a saint of her, gives her this name, which, and I must say, the name Fotini may be a name from tradition. It might not be her name. It might be just like me calling her Miriam. But when we name something, what we're really doing is saying, I'm not going to forget you, right? And so not only does she receive sainthood, but she gets the highest honor given by the church, and that is that she is equal to the apostles. I want that to just sit with us. Here's a woman, we didn't even know anything about her except she was out in the heat with Jesus by herself in the middle of the day, which might have been a sign of the way in which even her community had ostracized her. And now she has from the church the designation rarely, and that is rarely given, equal to that of the apostles. Now, I would agree that one ought not come to life with that as an ambition and say, when I leave here, I want to be equal to the apostles. That sounds more like hubris. It's very dangerous. And so much of what happens in our world today is based on ambition and not just on the power of our story. And so what I want to say today, very simply, I want to talk to people who have just been going through their regular routine every day. The people here who have don't seem to be making any waves in the news, will never be mentioned of on any news channel, whatever your preference might be. But you've just been being you, authentically who you are. You never know what the people who come after you will say about how they appreciated the simplicity of your story, who you are, and what God has done in your life. I don't know, and we are not in control of that. I mean, in some ways we could try. One of the ways we try to, this is pun intended, to cement our legacy is to build statues of ourselves. Have somebody build a statue of us so we can remember I learned something in Brooklyn. There are statues of people who served in the war, and they would often be on a horse. And you could tell by the horse's posture how they died. If the horse was up, they died in battle. If their horse was on all four legs, they died after the war was over. I am not so keen on war imagery right now, because every one of us in some ways feels like we're fighting in a war, and if you have a war, you have to have an enemy. And we manufacture enemies because we don't talk to each other. We assume certain things about people. We assume that certain people are going to always be hostile to us because they're different from us. I cannot tell you how many times I have been somewhere where I was in an unfamiliar space, and some person without title, some person without position has come in a very quiet way to talk or to say something or to make me smile. The possibility of us learning how to be people of peace and being together as we watch both in this country and around the world daily signs of people clashing heads, arguing points, being against one another. The Samaritan woman, again, who was not, in first century Palestine, no one would have ever thought that we would be talking about her in 2024. She was a nobody. And yet, she tells her story. And what the people say at the end is what I want to leave with you to think about. They held on to her story so long that they believed. And note, when they found out that Jesus had come to be with her, they asked Jesus to stay 2 more days and to come to their houses. By her invitation, by her story, not by beating them over the head, that they had to be saved and all of these things, but just by telling the simple transformation that happened to her, people invited Jesus to their own home. I wonder sometimes when people talk with me or when I'm in spaces that are not mine, I wonder, do people as a part of that encounter invite Jesus into their own home? I'm remembering, as you know, that my visiting of sick is an important part of my work. I got a call from a church, from a family whose family member was dying in the hospital. So I ran over. At that time, I was young. People will not think, it is not far-fetched for me to tell somebody I'm a minister and now say, yes, I can see that. But then I was a young guy, so I kept my collar. So when I walked into the hospital, people would know that I was a minister. And I walked into the hospital to talk to the person at the information booth under the urgency of this family calling me about this death, pending death. And the person at the reception desk was nonplussed, could not have cared who I was. I was dressed like a minister, all those things, and boy, he just wasn't moving quick enough for me because I didn't know how much time we had. So I got a little aggressive with him. And I told him, I said, look, man, families called me. I don't have time to be finding an ID that says I'm a minister. I've already dressed. You need to let me in. The family is depending on me. And I kept hitting on him. I was really hard on him. I really was. And I finally said, let me speak to your supervisor. And I told the supervisor let me in. And the receptionist said, and you say you're a minister. That thing cut me like I would not believe. After I went to see the family, I went back to the reception person and I said to him, you know what, I'm sorry about how I interacted with you when I got here. I'm sorry. Because I don't want him to see all ministers that way. I don't want him to see me that way. Sometimes the conversation that we need to have is an earnest, I'm sorry. I wasn't at my best that day. I wasn't in a good place. And we never know, as people will remember those times in which we have confronted them, and then they're stuck with that. I wish in a lot of my relationships and interactions with people, I would get what the golfers call a mulligan. I'd love to do it again. But you can't. And so the posture then has to become to find ways, as this woman did, to just tell the story with such power, passion, and to believe it herself in such a way that they believed, and then the story ends. Then they told her, when we first came, we were believing because of your story. But now that we have had this encounter ourselves, we know for ourselves that this is who Jesus is. And that's our challenge. As I leave you today, thank God for our encounters. I do hope that you have been inspired by these stories and that they have made you to think differently about some things. But more importantly, I pray that one day these stories give rise to your stories where you can, on your own, without anything, if you never see me again, that it has set the seed so that you can tell others about the power of transformed life and living. I'm going to stop and we'll have some questions and answers, but I want to offer another song. I told you about Del Zora. There's another woman, she was 87 when she died. Her name was Dorothy Ginn. She was a small, diminutive woman in stature, but she had a whole lot of faith. And even though she knew that in the biblical metaphor, her earthly tabernacle was dissolving, she exhibited such courage and faith in the midst of walking into not the valley of the shadow of death, but the valley of death. And so that made music in my head. And so you heard Del Zora's song. Here is Dorothy's song. It starts off as a dirge. It is in the tradition of wailing and sorrow and profoundly resident pain. It simply says, from death to life, which is the hope of the faith. Now, if you keep talking about that, on the one hand, we say from death to life, and it hits us as reality. But for the people who have had their stories transformed, it does not become, as the writer of Thessaloniki, 1 Thessalonians would say, yes, we sorrow, but not without hope. And you will hear the speed of this song change. Same words, the speed will change. And you'll hear at the end a declaration, for we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. I am persuaded that neither death nor life, angels, principalities, powers, things present, height, depth, things present, things to come, nothing shall be able to separate us from the love of Christ, of God, which is found in Christ Jesus. So this is Dorothy's song. From death to life, from death to life, from death to life, I believe through pain to joy, through pain to joy, through pain to joy, I believe from death to life, from death to life, from death to life, I believe, I believe, I believe, I believe, I believe, I believe we win, we win, we win, we win, we win, we win. I believe, I believe. You've been wonderful. Thank you. Questions, comments, concerns, conundrums, criticisms, critiques. We're on the letter C today. Yes?
How did you get your music?
How-
And then how did you keep your music?
Very good question. So, you know me by now, everything has a story. My sister and brother took music from a private studio, and I'm 4 years younger than my brother. They would go in, Mrs. Smith was their teacher. Mrs. Smith was the piano teacher who had the ruler. Some of you know her, don't you? Mrs. Smith they'd go in and they would go in and practice their lessons in front of them, and they would make mistakes and all. I was sitting in the kitchen with my mom, and when they finished, I would go to the piano and play the song flawlessly. Now that's the truth. I had an ear. I started out with an ear. And so by the time I got to, and I could pick out anything, chords, all of that. I could move through things. I just had to listen and sit with it for a while. And so when I got to the 4th grade, my mom and dad had a conversation about me. And they said this: we're not going to let that talent go without some theory and without some sense of understanding music. So they put me in the studio with, by that time, the music teachers had changed. My music teacher did not have a ruler. And the truth of the matter is, I would play the music that she wanted me to, but I always had to also play something that I had heard on the radio. And so they accommodated me, you know. They didn't try to kill that gift. And so I started actually playing in the church. Here is the backstory. The church that my father was pastor of was in southeast Columbus, and there were people. It was a neighborhood church in every sense of the way. And there was a family. They actually lived cat-a-corner to us on the street. She played the piano, and he led all the music. And at the beginning of the church, that's what they did. When it came down time to offering, they sang a song. You can't beat God giving no matter how you try. And he would lead everybody. He'd be singing. He'd pull out of his pocket $1, and he'd ask for 50 cents change. My dad said, no way. So he fired them. And so we didn't have any musicians at the church at that time. But the story goes, my dad went into the sanctuary one day and kneeled at the piano bench. And he said these words, Lord, this is your piano. You fill this bench. And so I started playing the organ at 13, but I was 4 years behind a guy who was my age who started playing the piano at 9. And in that church of about 350 people, there were 10 homegrown musicians out of there because May Helen Stanley, who was the senior choir pianist, taught all of us music lessons. And they gave us opportunities. Well, I really wasn't looking for a way out of music, and I really wanted to be a church organist. But then something else happened. I didn't get knocked off of a beast or anything like that, but I accepted a call very early, and the pulpit got in the way. But I never lost my music, and it is the way that I have been playing before these times just to calm myself down. And there's something about music, too. When you're composing music, you're trying to strike notes that match your pathos in that moment, how I'm feeling. So you heard in this song at the beginning a lot of minor chords. Death to life, death to life. But the last chord in that is a major chord. It moves from the to life. I believe, I believe. And so I try to do things like that, and I write music for the church. They sing it in the liturgy. Right now, the problem is that since we have been out of church for so long, if we're not careful, we're going to lose those hymns. And I'm not quite ready to do that. And so the other thing that has happened in the pandemic is that church has become more of a production because you've got people who are streaming, and the people who are running things who are running the production need you to have tight things going, which drives me crazy. But and I recognize as we're doing and moving all those ways through the service that we don't have opportunity. If we're not careful, the people who come to church right now, the way we do church, will only sit there. They're just watching and observing. It's like going to the concert. So create some spaces where people have to sing their way in. So like before the sermon, we sing a cappella. I may start patting my foot and I'll say, we need a word. We need a word. If we're going to pass from death to life, we need a word. And in my tradition, when people hear that song first, they know I've just given you the tune, so now you have to try it. We need a word. We need a word. If we're going to pass from death to life, we need a word. I'll do it again so you can get it. We need a word. We need a word. If we're going to pass from death to life, we need a word. Let me see how good you are. If we're going to pass from death to life, we need a word for emphasis. If we're going to pass from death to life, there it is. The people grab it and we sing, and then we go into. But I'm trying to create. My music is more community oriented. You notice all the lyrics are very simple. I don't want to complicate things. I'm just trying to get people to sound together, which is important. But thank you for that question. I was thinking, say maybe one of these times if I'm ever asked back, Charlie, we'll do music, and we'll do music and talk about some of that thing. Yeah, it might be. I'm not pitching for myself, but if I happen to come back, we'll spend a little more time with you singing. Okay, thank you. Other questions? Yes, sir. And thank you, Jim, for.
Oh. Yeah, just a just a comment on the structure of the story. It's very interesting how we have Jesus' words about the fields being ripe for harvest, which we talked about earlier. That's really a prelude to the success of the Samaritan mission done jointly by Fotini and Jesus himself. I also want to just make a quick comment about that honorific title, equal to the apostles. You're right, of course, that we're talking about a misogynistic culture. But Fotini's in good company, because there are two others from her generation who were also designated equal to the apostles. One is Mary Magdalene, who first brought the message of the resurrection to the other apostles, and the other is Phoebe, the deaconess in Romans 16. And even back then, being a deacon in the Orthodox Church is a really big deal. You are clergy. You've got to go to seminary. You're way up there. We're not known for having male clergy, but we had women deaconesses for 1,000 years. St. Phoebe, equal to the apostles, being one of them.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. This is why it's important for us to have conversation, because we get to fill in some other gaps and we get to learn some other things. Absolutely. And Mary Magdalene, the only person, not just the one who carries the gospel, but the only person who is mentioned at the crucifixion in all of the gospel stories. And it's very interesting to watch that. And of course, well, I think, thank you for adding those. And we have to be reminded that even despite the kind of clamps that are placed, that there are some people who are so exceptional in their passion for this story or their devotion to Jesus. It's hard to ignore them. You can't get around the women you've just mentioned, and rightfully so. They serve their place in the church history. Thank you. Other questions, comments, sir? Well, again, let me thank you. I am just who I am. There's no pretense with me, and I appreciate what I am old enough to remember when you first started doing word processing in WordPerfect, right? How many of you remember that, right? And you had to put the codes inside to get the kind of font that you wanted on the blue screen. Do you remember that? Well, then actually, Apple actually took its cues from Atari that started the gym-based computer screen and started this thing, is what they said, WYSIWYG. You know what that is, right? What you see is what you get. That's who I want to be. I don't want to be anybody else, but I want you to see, I want you to get me, and you have done that. And I am indebted to you for this opportunity to inspire me to keep going a little while longer. And when I see you again, we are not strangers at this point. You're friends to me, and this is a very sacred place in my life, and I'm grateful to God for that. And thank you again for having me, Charlie. Appreciate it.
Gary, we're so indebted to you for your time spent with us. And I had said to my wife earlier in the week, I wish I was a seminary student again and would be able to take a class on preaching with Gary. I think it would be a wonderful experience. I know it would be. And it gives me a great idea. Our director of music for religious life at Chautauqua is Michael Schertz, who's a jazz musician, and I'm seeing a seminar or a Faith for Living with you and Michael together, maybe in our future. So keep that in mind. And I always ask the preachers if they would be willing to come back, and Gary